Rain hammered the rusted roof of the old shed like 1,000 fists, each strike echoing through the veteran's chest as he stepped closer to the sound. He hadn't meant to stop here. His truck had broken down on the deserted country road, the engine hissing like an exhausted soldier. But then came the whimper. Fragile, fractured, a thread of life unraveling from the dark. He froze, boots sinking into mud, breath catching in his throat. The air stank of rot, of damp straw and something worse, something dying. Inside, his flashlight's beam sliced through the gloom, catching 3 pairs of eyes, dim and hollow, sunken into skulls too thin to belong to the proud creatures they once were. German shepherds. Their ribs jutted like prison bars, formatted with filth, skin raw with sores. One tried to lift its head but collapsed, muzzle striking the floor with a dull thud. The veteran's stomach turned, memories clawing at him. Sandstorms, cries for help, brothers he couldn't save. His hands trembled as he reached for them, whispering words he hadn't spoken in years. "Not this time," he said, voice breaking, as the rain outside roared louder, as though the world itself demanded an answer. The rain had a way of drowning silence, and yet, in the veteran's ears, it amplified every ghost he carried. His truck had sputtered its last breath a mile back, and the night seemed determined to pin him in place, a prisoner of the storm. He pulled his jacket tighter, though the cold was less biting than the weight in his chest. He had known storms before. Deserts where sand cut skin like glass, jungles where heat pressed against lungs until breathing felt like betrayal. But this storm was different. This storm carried a sound that cracked his armor. At first it was faint, so faint he thought it might be his mind reaching for something to fill the void. A whimper, a threadbare sound carried on the wind, fragile as glass. He stopped, boots sinking deeper into mud, and turned his head. The whimper came again, sharper this time, laced with pain. His body stiffened, instincts firing in directions he hadn't allowed them to in years. He followed every step heavier, until the outline of a shed emerged from the dark, its wood swollen and warped by years of neglect. The door hung loose, rattling against the frame like a final warning. He should have kept walking. That's what the logical part of him whispered. The part that told him he'd seen enough death, that not everything broken was his to fix. But his hand reached anyway, pushing the door with a creak that cut through the storm. His flashlight flickered on, slicing into the shadows. What it revealed pinned his breath in his throat. 3 pairs of eyes glowed back at him, dull and sunken, the kind of eyes that had once known life but now clung to it with desperation. German shepherds, or what remained of them. Their bodies were skeletal, ribs pressing against skin as though trying to break free. Fur clumped and matted, patches of flesh exposed, raw with sores. The stench of urine, mold, and rot choked the air. One dog tried to stand, its legs quivering like broken reeds, but it collapsed, head striking the floor with a thud that echoed inside him like a gunshot. He froze, breath shallow. The sound was too familiar, too much like the men he had watched fall in another life, in a desert half a world away. His stomach clenched, bile rising, memory overlaying reality until he couldn't separate the shed from the battlefield. He squeezed his eyes shut, knuckles whitening around the flashlight. His chest burned, heart hammering against scar tissue both visible and invisible. When he opened his eyes again, the dogs hadn't moved. Their gazes held him, not pleading, not demanding, just holding as if daring him to turn away. And something inside him cracked. He lowered himself to the floor, knees pressing into damp straw, hand reaching out with a tremor he couldn't control. The nearest shepherd flinched, a weak growl rumbling from a throat too dry to sustain it. His hand stopped in the air, hovering, palm open. Slowly he whispered, words he hadn't spoken aloud in years, words he had once used to calm terrified men in the dark. "You're not alone. Not anymore." The dog's breathing rasped, uneven, but its eyes softened just enough to allow his hand to rest against its head. Its fur was coarse, tangled, but beneath it, he felt the faint throb of life. Fragile, fading, but there. His throat tightened, and he swallowed hard, pushing back against the tears that threatened. He couldn't cry. Not now. The storm outside raged, wind howling through the cracks, rain hammering the roof. But inside the silence was louder. He sat among them, their frail bodies pressing against the earth, and felt the weight of a decision descend upon him. He knew what it meant to walk away. He had done it before, left bodies behind because he had no choice, buried faces in his memory that he could never erase. But this was different. Here he had a choice. Here, life still clung to the edges of darkness, waiting for someone to pull it back. His voice broke as he spoke again, louder this time, as though addressing the storm itself. "Not this time. I'm not leaving you here." The words hung in the air, trembling, fragile, but they held. He pushed himself to his feet, scanning the shed for anything that could help. An old rope, a rusted pail. Nothing useful. His gaze returned to the dogs, their sides heaving shallowly. They needed more than what this place could give. They needed more than what he was sure he had left in him. But he had promised. He crouched again, slipping his arms beneath the nearest shepherd. The dog whimpered, a sharp, broken sound that tore through him, but it didn't resist. Its body was lighter than he expected, bones and skin, no weight of muscle or strength. He cradled it against his chest, feeling the frailty, the fragility of a heartbeat fighting against the inevitable. He carried it outside, rain soaking him instantly, and laid it gently in the truck bed, wrapping it in his jacket. He went back, again and again, until all three lay together, their breaths shallow but present, their eyes flickering with a faint, desperate hope. When he slid into the driver's seat, water dripping from his hair into his eyes, he gripped the steering wheel with trembling hands. The truck coughed, sputtered, but roared to life, as though it, too, understood the urgency. He glanced back at them, three lives tethered to the thinnest thread, and whispered, voice raw and breaking, "Hold on. Please just hold on." The road stretched before him, dark and slick, the storm pressing down. He drove into it anyway, headlights slicing through sheets of rain, heart pounding with a fear he hadn't felt in years, not for himself but for them. Each mile was a battle. Each glance at the truck bed a reminder that this was no longer about survival of memory, but survival of the present. The storm roared. The world blurred. And somewhere between the weight of the past and the fragile hope of the present, a broken soldier and three dying dogs began their fight for life together. The storm kept shifting its weight across the sky as if deciding where to break next, and the wipers could barely keep the windshield from turning into a sheet of drowning glass. He drove hunched forward, jaw clenched, listening for sounds that didn't belong to the truck. The wet cough of an engine bearing down, a fallen branch cracking under tire, the fragile rasp of breath from the bed behind him. He couldn't hear them over the rain. That ignorance gnawed like teeth. Every 100 yards he'd flash the headlights backward, as if light could reach through steel. It couldn't. He pressed harder on the gas, the truck skidding. The world reduced to twin tunnels of light pouring into black. The town was 15 minutes when the roads were dry and the sky merciful. Tonight the sky was a fist. He remembered training steady your breathing, count the seconds, count the miles, break the impossible into pieces the body can carry. He breathed in for 4, held for 4, out for 4, like they taught recruits who'd never seen a night like this. Somewhere between those measured exhales a thought slid in, quick and cruel. What if they died in the bed of his truck? And he didn't know until the rain stopped. He swallowed it down, turned the radio dial until static gave way to the barest whisper of a talk station, some distant human voice threading through the squall. He left it there, proof that life still existed beyond the sealed cocoon of this cab. The first dog had moved when he braked at a flooded intersection, a weak shift, a scraping of claws against metal. Relief hit so hard it hurt. "Hold on," he said again to them, to himself, to the night. He took a left where the road curled past a field and a stand of pines, branches tossing like the arms of drowning men, and aimed for the glow he knew would be there even now. A red neon sign that looked dull by day and holy by night, Emergi and Veterinare. He hadn't been there in years, not since a neighbor's cat had taken a bad fall and he'd driven them both in silence while the neighbor sobbed. He tried to remember the vet's name. It came like a match flaring, Petal. Small-shouldered, kind eyes that tilted at the outer corners like wings at rest. The parking lot was a bright slickness under floodlights. He swung in crooked, killed the engine, and the quiet felt violent after the noise. Only the pounding of rain and his own heart left. He leaped out and the storm swallowed him. Water instantly through his clothes, cold like a dare. The door to the bed was stiff. He wrestled it down, breath turning to fog around his face. And the sight of them in that white wash of light was somehow worse than in the shed. Their faces were grayish now, gums pale, eyes half-lidded. The smallest had slid into the curve of the other two, as if seeking a heartbeat to match. He gathered the heaviest first, arms under ribs and hips the way he'd been taught to carry wounded who might have internal injuries. The dog's head lolled against his shoulder, breath hot with the thick sweetness of starvation. It didn't make a sound. "Help!" he shouted before the doors even opened. Glass, bright, the sterile smell of antiseptic rushing out to meet the mud and rot in his clothes. Two techs appeared as if pulled by a wire, one with a blanket already unraveled, the other pushing a gurney. Words chased at him. "What happened? How long are they yours?" And he said what he could, found them. "Not long, not mine." It didn't matter. Hands moved, the vet appeared, short hair plastered to her forehead from some previous dash into weather, mask looped around her neck like an oath. Dr. Patel. He saw her register the scene in a single look. 3 dogs, one barely responsive, all severely emaciated, hypothermic from rain and shock. "We've got you," she said. Not to him, or maybe only partly. "Let's go." It became a choreography of urgency, a small ballot no one had the energy to admire. They slid the first shepherd onto the gurney, a tech's hand steady on its chest, feeling for a rhythm. He went back for the second, heavier with water, ribs like a ladder under his palms. The third tried to lift its head and failed, a weak nasally cry escaping, a strange puppyish sound from a body too big. He gathered it gently and followed the procession into the place where fluorescent light met trembling life. The doors swung behind him, muting the storm, and the quiet became clinical, a different kind of relentless. They moved one to each exam table. Towels unfurled, hair dryers set to low heat murmured like summer insects. Someone slipped a thermometer under a tail, read numbers that made Dr. Patel's mouth go flat. "Hypothermic," she said. "Severe dehydration. Blood glucose is likely a mess. Start warm IV fluids. Dextrose drip on the smallest. Let's get warming pads, no direct heat on the skin. Gentle, gentle." Her hands were swift and precise, the kind of motion that made belief contagious. He stood useless, soaked, watching them place catheters into veins that seemed too small, taping lines down while murmuring reassurances the dogs couldn't possibly understand and yet seemed to breathe. The tiniest movements mattered, the slow lift of a chest, a swallow, the blink that was really just a breath behind the eyes. "Sir," a tech said, and he realized she'd been trying to get his attention. "You're bleeding." He looked down. Skin scraped raw across his forearms, probably from where rusted bed met rain. Slick dog, and his hands didn't care. He shook his head. "Later," he said, and a ghost of a grin flickered in the tech's eyes. Later was unwritten, now had stitches of its own. Patel came to stand beside him at the second table, the one where the smallest dog lay under a burrito of towels like a bundled child. Its ear twitched when she touched its neck. "Found them in a shed?" she asked, not as glare but as inventory. He nodded. "They were left," he said, and the word "left" opened a trap door in his chest because of the things he'd also left and could not forgive. "How long do you think?" "Days," she said softly. "Maybe a week or more without real food. Parasitic load is anyone's guess. The good news is they're not in organ failure yet, at least not obvious. The bad news is we are teetering." She looked up at him, eyes clear. "We're going to fight. Thank you for bringing them." He wanted to say something like it was nothing, but his throat was tight. He just nodded, kept his gaze on their chests, counting rises like prayers. For a moment the hums and beeps of the clinic blurred into the throb of memory, triage tense in heat like an oven door opening, the smell of sweat and iron, the way men spoke in half sentences because full ones took too much breath. He remembered pressing his palm to a friend's sternum, the hope he could push time backward. That hope hadn't been enough. It never was. The difference tonight was the permission to keep going without orders or a clock. Time became strange next. It widened and narrowed. A monitor beeped erratically for a heartbeat and then settled. The smallest shepherd's tongue flicked against a tech's gloved finger, tasting the world. Someone taped a laminated sign above the first table, "Warming, no hot packs," and the caution felt like tenderness spelled out. The vet phoned for a fecal test, a baseline panel, a quick ultrasound if the smallest stabilized. He drifted between tables like a man circling a campfire, seeking heat for his hands. Every time he paused, he found a point of contact, a paw cupped in his palm, a brow stroke just between the eyes, the soft leather of an ear he smoothed with a gentleness that surprised him. The dog's breath seemed to slow around his touch. Or maybe that was him, counting in fours. "Names?" a tech asked, filling a chart, pen hovering. He glanced at the dogs and felt absurd. I don't know. I only just." The tech smiled, small and lightning quick. "We can note them as Shepherd A, B, and C for now." He watched the pen scratch the letters and decided that felt too cold. The big one, Kaiser, he said, surprising himself. The middle Sable. And the little one, Ash. He didn't know why the names arrived together, but when he said them the heads on the tables turned faintly, as if syllables had weight, as if being claimed pulled them a molecule closer to the surface. There was a moment when Ash's breathing hitched and stopped. Not long, more like a skipped note in a song you love, and 4 people in the room moved at once. Drip checked and adjusted. Finger rubbed briskly along the braced bone. A murmur in a voice like water on stone. "Stay," he heard himself say, the word leaving him before thought, the same syllable he had used to steady hands in helicopter wash. "Stay, Ash." And then the chest rose again, stubborn, small. He exhaled carefully like a man setting a glass he's sure will shatter. At some point a receptionist with mercy in her posture approached him with a clipboard that had boxes and amounts in lines that looked like fences. She began the sentence with an apology, a script for those who arrive with hearts first and wallets not always second. He didn't let her finish. "Whatever it is," he said, "I'll figure it out." He thought of his savings such as they were, sitting in a bank like a modest houseplant, waiting for sun that never came. He thought of his tools he could sell. A motorcycle he hadn't ridden in years because the road whips the past into a livable shape, and sometimes he was afraid he'd ride until there was no gas, no map, no reason to stop. The receptionist's eyebrows softened into gratitude that made him look away. He signed where she pointed. The paper shook under his pen. Patel checked gums, checked response to light, listened to hearts, nodded almost imperceptibly when something pleased her. She spoke to him in doses, like a second infusion. "We'll keep them overnight. Heat and fluids. Tiny amounts of easy food when they're ready. Rice porridge, warmed broth. Antibiotics once we have labs. If they make it through tonight, their odds go up. The body wants to live, it remembers." He stayed. He stripped off his soaked jacket and a tech brought him a towel that smelled of hospital laundry and something faintly floral. The clinic had a back room with a coffee machine that wheezed like it was doing him a favor. He drank a paper cup of something brown that passed for comfort, and watched the rain smear the outside world into a dream he'd stepped out of. Midnight came and went. The fluorescent lights hummed opinions. The dogs slept in fits and starts, each twitch like a sentence inside a dream. He learned the cadence of Kaiser's sigh, the way Sable's paws flexed as if testing the idea of ground, the way Ash's chest stuttered back into rhythm if his fingers stroked under the collarbone where bone and heart seemed to share a wall. Somewhere in the thinner hours he dozed in the chair between their tables, head tipping forward, chin nearly touching the sternum the army had hardened and grief had hollowed. He woke with a start to the sound of soft retching and was on his feet before the tech could reach the table. Sable was trying to lift to vomit. He steadied the head, angled the towel, murmured meaningless syllables that somehow contained meaning. The vomit was mostly bile and water. The tech wiped, replaced towels, praised softly as if they'd done something brave. Sable's eyes found his and lingered, and he saw there a question he couldn't answer yet. "Are you staying?" He leaned closer so his face filled the dog's field of vision. "I'm here." Dawn came as a suggestion, the black outside the windows softening to a damp gray that made everything inside look impossibly clean. The storm had quieted to a whisper. The overnight tech yawned. Patel returned from a nap he hadn't seen her take and read numbers off a chart that had become, to him, a less complicated Bible. Temperatures improving. Hydration slowly coming up. No obvious bloat, thank God. We're not out of woods, but the trail's not closing behind us. He didn't realize he'd been holding his breath until it came out as a shaky laugh. They offered to let him go home, sleep, change. But even the thought of separating from the room made his chest cinch. He washed his scraped arms in a sink until the water ran clear and pink, accepted band, aids he didn't need, and returned to his chair. He watched Ash try to lift a head the weight of an apple. He watched Kaiser's ears twitch at sounds no one else perceived. He watched Sable's paw, wrapped in tape to keep the catheter secure, attempt to tap at the edge of the blanket once, twice, like knocking at a door politely. He placed his hand where the knock landed and waited until the paw rested there, until the weight of it felt like permission. By mid-morning, the clinic smelled less like panic and more like hope washed in bleach. A volunteer arrived with a Tupperware of boiled chicken and rice, steam lifting like small prayers. Teeny tiny amounts, Dr. Patel said, holding her fingers a sliver apart. He pinched the grains, dipped them in broth, and offered them to Sable, who blinked, sniffed, and finally accepted one grain on the tongue as if learning a new language. It took 20 minutes to deliver a teaspoon. He counted each swallow like a footstep back from a cliff. Kaiser watched with the solemn interest of a general assessing rations. Ash slept through it, exhausted by the effort of surviving night. When he stepped outside to call the tow truck for his abandoned pickup, the air was rinsed. Puddles mirrored the sky like broken plates reflecting someone else's ceiling. He stood on the curb, phone at his ear, the clinic's glass door behind him framing the dogs in the corner of his eye, and felt something uncoil that had been knotted for years. He didn't call anyone else. There was no one else to call. No wife to iron panic flat, no brother to joke until tension cracked, no parent left to worry on his behalf. There was just the tow company and the knowledge that when the truck came, he wasn't going home. Not yet. His home had shifted 4 blocks inward, into a fluorescent room where 3 dogs were learning trust in increments. By the time he returned to the doorway, Ash was awake, pupils wide. He went to the table and leaned close. The puppyish whine came again, soft and embarrassing to the dog, if such a thing could be true. He slid a hand under Ash's jaw and felt the fine tremor there, like a violin string after a long note. "You did it," he whispered, and the dog's eyes closed as if he'd laid a blanket over light. No one declared victory. No one rang a bell. But when noon arrived and the clouds tore themselves thin, the clinic grew brighter without turning on a single switch. Dr. Patel presented him with a new calculus. If they continued to stabilize, they could be discharged to foster care with strict instructions. Or, she said, lifting her chin, one dark eyebrow forming a question mark, they can go with you, if you're prepared. It's a lot. It's around the clock for a while. Meds, feedings, cleaning. And patience. She didn't know the shape of his hours, the empty spaces inside them, how the night sometimes stretched like wire across a canyon that only routine could cross. He looked at Kaiser, whose breathing had settled into a rhythm he could nearly nap to, at Sable, who had accepted 2 teaspoons of food and seemed proud in the modest way of the newly loved, at Ash, whose body had found the memory of warmth and was not willing to forget. He knew what weight felt like. He'd carried it across deserts and years. He nodded, once. "They come with me." If there was a second when fear surged, what if he failed them? He allowed it to swell and pass like the last ragged gusts of the storm. He signed new forms, learned dosage amounts and the way to insert pills without making them future wolves. He memorized the protocol for fevers, the timing for tiny meals, the art of warming a blanket in the dryer and placing it just so. He watched the tech demonstrate syringing water along the gums so it dribbled in slow enough not to choke. He absorbed this education like a man building a raft from the lumber of a shipwreck. When he finally shepherded them, Kaiser supported in a sling, Sable walking with a wobbling dignity, Ash carried bundled against his chest like a blessing. Out into the clean light, the air smelled of wet asphalt, eucalyptus, and the strange sweetness of beginnings disguised as emergencies. The world looked briefly new and a little too bright. He opened the truck door. Careful with lines he'd learned to secure with vet wrap, arranged towels like nests, spoke each name quietly with the kind of appreciation most people reserve for stars. Traffic moved at the end of the block, indifferent, rhythmic. Somewhere a child laughed in a puddle and his body remembered that laughter is the sound of a present moment expanded. He took a breath that went all the way down. The dogs watched him with the particular stillness of creatures who have recalibrated their definition of safety to include one person. He set his palm on the edge of the truck bed, felt the vibrations of their hearts through steel, and whispered to the road, the sky, the town, to whatever god or accident had arranged this, "We're going home." The tires rolled, the town thinned. Trees stood like witnesses relieved to resume their quiet labor of growing. He drove not as a soldier evacuating wounded, not as a man outrunning himself, but as someone returning to a place he'd only just discovered inside his own 4 walls. The house would smell like dust and coffee and missed mornings. That would change. It already had, with 3 new breathing metronomes to reset the hours, to insist that night be made of intervals and day of small triumphs. Rain clung to the edges of the windshield where the wipers couldn't reach, tiny prisms holding the last of the storm's grief. He let them stay until sunlight found them and turned each drop into a bead of light. The house felt like an empty barracks when he opened the door, quiet in a way that used to feel like safety, but now scraped at him with hollowness. He flicked on the kitchen light, its yellow bulb buzzing overhead, and for a moment he wondered if the walls themselves could bear the weight of what he was about to bring inside. 3 lives, fragile as glass, carried in on his back like the remnants of a mission gone sideways. He set them down gently, one by one, on makeshift beds of towels and blankets he'd hurriedly spread across the living room floor before retrieving them from the truck. The air smelled of wet fur, antiseptic, and the faint metallic tang of IV tape still clinging to their legs. Kaiser curled into himself immediately, ribs expanding with shallow but steady breaths. Sable lifted her head just enough to watch him with suspicious eyes, as if she still hadn't decided whether his presence was safety or threat. Ash, the smallest, lay motionless, his eyes barely open, chest rising only because it hadn't yet remembered how to stop. The veteran crouched beside them, hand on the edge of the blanket, and felt his heart twist in a way he hadn't let it twist in years. He realized then that this was no rescue finished. This was a war of inches about to begin. The first night stretched like a campaign. He rationed broth into syringe barrels, kneeling on the floor to coax droplets into their mouths, watching their throats work weakly to accept. The sound of rain still lingered outside, now softer, a memory more than a threat, but in here the air was thick with effort, theirs and his. He fed them one by one, the silence broken only by the sound of swallowing and his own murmured encouragements. "That's it, Sable, just a little more, Ash, good boy, Kaiser." His voice cracked when he spoke Ash's name, as though saying it tethered the fragile creature tighter to life. At intervals he sat back, shoulders pressed to the wall, exhaustion draping over him like a lead blanket. The house was too quiet otherwise. He turned on the radio volume low and let a late-night jazz station spill into the corners of the room. The soft trumpet notes curled in the air, warmer than silence, filling cracks the walls had held for years. Kaiser's ears twitched toward the music, a faint sign of recognition, and the veteran felt a flicker of something, hope maybe, that had been absent from his chest for so long it startled him. Morning came pale and cold, filtering through the blinds like hesitant fingers. He hadn't slept, not really. Every time his eyes closed, he jolted awake to check their chests, counting each rise like a sentry in a watchtower. By dawn their breathing had steadied, fragile but not failing. He sat there on the floor, head heavy in his hands, whispering into the new day. You made it through the night. It became routine, then, though every routine was stitched with fear. Feedings at measured hours. Cleaning their sores with gentle dabs of warm cloth. Medications arranged on the counter like ammunition lined for battle. He moved carefully, his body remembering military discipline, but softened now by tenderness he had once buried. Some days, Sable snarled weakly when he approached, a flash of teeth dulled by exhaustion. He didn't flinch. He spoke to her like a soldier to another soldier, words steady and low. I know it hurts, but we'll get through it." Other days, Kaiser whimpered like a child when he shifted on his blanket, the sound slicing into the veteran's chest deeper than shrapnel ever had. Ash simply slept, breathing shallow, surviving in increments. Weeks blurred. His house no longer smelled like solitude. It smelled of broth and medicine, wet fur drying by the heater, the faint vinegar tang of disinfectant. The silence was broken by the shuffle of paws against blankets, the clink of bowls, the sound of his own voice filling air that used to hang heavy with ghosts. He learned their patterns, Kaiser's stubbornness, Sable's wary intelligence, Ash's fragile dependence. He learned, too, his own capacity to stay, to nurture, to open his chest to beings who asked for nothing but presence. One night, as he sat with them in the living room, lamp light flickering gold across the walls, he realized he was breathing differently. Not shallow, not pressed. Full, like air was moving into places it had avoided for years. He watched Kaiser's ribs rise and fall with strength they hadn't had weeks ago, saw Sable lift her head without trembling, felt Ash's small paw rest against his hand with a weight that wasn't desperate anymore but trusting. And in that moment, surrounded by the warmth of 3 fragile but rising lives, he understood this wasn't just their healing, it was his. When the seasons turned and the air softened, the 3 of them ran across the yard as if they'd been born to that patch of earth. Kaiser, once a skeleton of ribs and sorrow, bounded with the authority of a guardian restored. Sable trotted behind, head high, her eyes no longer hollow but alive with the sharpness of trust earned. Ash, smallest and frailest, barked in short, joyful bursts, his paws kicking up dirt like sparks from a fire that refused to die. The veteran stood at the porch, watching, the late sun painting their coats in molten gold. His chest ached, not from grief this time but from the fullness of it all. Neighbors had begun to stop by, offering treats, pats and smiles drawn not just by the dog's survival but by the quiet man who had chosen not to turn away. The story had traveled farther than he ever expected, touching lives he'd never meet. But standing there, he knew the truth, that the rescue wasn't his gift to them, but theirs to him. They had given him back mornings worth waking for, silences filled with breath, and nights that ended in peace. He whispered their names into the wind. "We're home."